Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet tall with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes that held a quiet determination. What most people didn't know about Sarah was that she carried secrets that would surprise them. Growing up in a military family, she had learned things that most young women never needed to know. Her father, Colonel James Martinez, had served 3 tours overseas before retiring to a small town in Colorado. He had raised Sarah and her 2 brothers with the same discipline and respect he demanded from his soldiers. But Sarah was special. While her brothers played video games, she practiced martial arts. While other girls worried about makeup and dating, Sarah learned how to handle herself in dangerous situations. The trouble started on a Tuesday evening at Murphy's Diner, a popular spot near the local community college where Sarah worked as a part-time waitress while studying nursing. The diner was busy that night, filled with college students, truckers passing through town, and local families enjoying their weekly dinner out. Sarah moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing plates and taking orders with a smile that made even the grumpiest customers feel welcome. That's when they walked in. 4 men in their late 20s wearing leather jackets and boots that clicked loudly against the tile floor. They had the look of trouble about them, the kind of men who thought their size and attitude gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. The leader was a tall, broad-shouldered man with tattoos covering his arms and a scar running down his left cheek. His name was Jake Morrison, and he had a reputation in town that made most people cross the street when they saw him coming. Jake and his friends found an empty table in the back corner of the diner and immediately began making noise. They spoke loudly, laughed too hard at their own jokes, and made comments about the other customers that were meant to be heard. Sarah noticed them right away but continued with her work, hoping they would just eat and leave without causing any problems. But Jake had other plans. He had seen Sarah around town before and had always been interested in getting her attention. Tonight, with his friends backing him up and enough beer already in his system to make him feel invincible, he decided it was time to make his move. When Sarah approached their table to take their order, Jake leaned back in his chair and looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. His friends snickered and whispered among themselves, clearly enjoying the show. Sarah kept her professional smile in place and pulled out her notepad, determined to get through this interaction as quickly as possible. Jake ordered for the whole table, making sure to brush his hand against Sarah's arm when she wrote down their drinks. She stepped back politely but firmly, maintaining her composure even as her heart began to beat faster. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about this group felt different, more dangerous. As the evening went on, Jake and his friends became more aggressive. They called Sarah over repeatedly, asking for things they didn't need and making comments that grew increasingly inappropriate. The other customers began to notice, and the friendly atmosphere of the diner started to shift. People spoke in quieter voices and glanced nervously toward the back corner where the 4 men sat. Sarah's manager, an older man named Bill who had run the diner for 20 years, noticed what was happening and came over to check on her. Bill was a good man who cared about his employees, but he was also past 60 and not equipped to handle 4 young men who clearly didn't respect authority. When he politely asked them to keep their voices down and treat his staff with respect, Jake stood up to his full height and told Bill exactly what he thought of his request. The confrontation escalated quickly. Jake's friends joined in, surrounding Bill and making it clear that they weren't going anywhere. Other customers began to look uncomfortable, and a few families with children decided to leave early, rather than risk getting caught up in whatever was about to happen. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her hands clenched into fists as she fought the urge to step in. She knew that getting involved would only make things worse, but every instinct her father had trained into her was screaming at her to act. These men were bullies, and bullies only understood one language. But Sarah also knew something that Jake and his friends didn't. She knew that sometimes the smallest person in the room could be the most dangerous. She knew that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned. And she knew that her father hadn't spent all those years teaching her to defend herself, just so she could stand by and watch good people get hurt. As Jake pushed Bill backward and his friends closed in, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked out from behind the counter. The diner fell silent as every eye turned to watch the small young woman approach 4 men who could easily overpower her. What happened next would be talked about in that small Colorado town for years to come. It would become the kind of story that parents told their children about standing up to bullies and doing what's right even when you're scared. It would be the story of how Sarah Martinez proved that courage isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being willing to do what needs to be done when others can't or won't. The tension in Murphy's diner was about to reach its breaking point, and Sarah Martinez was walking straight into the center of it all. Sarah approached the group with steady steps, her heart pounding but her expression calm. Years of training had taught her that the first rule of conflict was never to show fear, even when you felt it. Jake Morrison turned to look at her as she drew near, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred face. He clearly thought this tiny waitress was going to beg him to leave her boss alone. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. Bill looked at Sarah with worry in his eyes, shaking his head slightly as if to tell her to stay back. But Sarah had made her choice. She stopped just outside the circle that Jake's friends had formed around her manager and spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent diner. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. My manager was just trying to make sure everyone has a good experience tonight. Why don't we all take a step back and figure this out like adults?" Jake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the diner's walls. His friends joined in, clearly amused by what they saw as a ridiculous situation. A girl who barely came up to Jake's chest was trying to mediate a conflict between them and her boss. It was comedy gold as far as they were concerned. "Look at this, boys," Jake said, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "The little waitress thinks she's going to save the day. That's real cute, sweetheart, but this doesn't concern you. Why don't you run along and get us another round of beers while the grown-ups handle business?" Sarah didn't move. She kept her eyes locked on Jake's, refusing to be intimidated by his size or his attitude. Behind her, she could hear other customers whispering nervously, and she knew that Bill was probably terrified for her safety. But Sarah also knew something that none of them understood yet. "I appreciate the offer," she said calmly, "but I think you gentlemen have had enough to drink for tonight, and I think it's time for you to settle your bill and head home. Your meal comes to $47.36. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Jake seemed momentarily stunned by her audacity. Here was this small young woman, standing alone against four men who could easily hurt her, and she was essentially telling them to pay up and get out. The sheer boldness of it caught everyone off guard. But Jake's surprise quickly turned to anger. He took a step towards Sarah, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her like a mountain over a pebble. His breath smelled of beer and cigarettes, and his eyes had the cold look of someone who had hurt people before and enjoyed it. "Listen here, little girl," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea who you're messing with. I could break you in half without breaking a sweat. So I suggest you apologize for your attitude and bring us those beers before I decide to teach you some manners." Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if she was genuinely considering his words. Around the diner, people held their breath waiting to see what would happen next. A few customers had quietly pulled out their phones, ready to call the police if things got violent. Others were calculating the fastest route to the exit. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "my father used to tell me something when I was growing up. He said that the loudest dog in the pack is usually the most scared, and the biggest bully is usually the weakest person in the room." Jake's face darkened with rage. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment it looked like he might actually swing at her. His friends sensed the escalation and began to close in tighter, forming a circle around Sarah that would make it difficult for anyone to help her if things went bad. But Sarah wasn't finished talking. "He also told me," she continued in that same calm voice, "that there are two kinds of strength in this world. There's the strength that comes from muscle and intimidation, and there's the strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. The first kind might win a few fights, but the second kind builds character." One of Jake's friends, a stocky man with greasy hair, laughed nervously. "Jake, man, just grab her and let's get out of here. This is getting weird." But Jake was too angry to think clearly now. Sarah's words had hit something deep inside him, something that reminded him of all the times in his life when he had felt small and powerless. He had spent years building his reputation as someone not to mess with, and he wasn't about to let some college girl tear it down in front of a room full of witnesses. "That's enough," he snarled, reaching out to grab Sarah's arm. "Time for your lesson." That's when everything changed. Sarah moved faster than anyone in the diner thought possible. One moment Jake was reaching for her, confident in his ability to intimidate her into submission. The next moment he was staring at her in shock, his wrist caught in her grip and twisted at an angle that made him gasp in pain. The transformation in Sarah was immediate and complete. The nervous young waitress was gone, replaced by someone who moved with the precision and confidence of a trained fighter. Her eyes never left Jake's face as she applied just enough pressure to his wrist to make her point clear, without actually breaking anything. "Rule number 1, she said quietly, her voice now carrying a steel edge that made everyone in the diner pay attention. "Never put your hands on someone without permission. Rule number 2, if you do put your hands on someone, you better be prepared for them to put their hands on you." Jake tried to pull away, but Sarah's grip was like iron. His friends started to move forward to help him, but something in Sarah's expression made them hesitate. There was a confidence there that suggested she wasn't nearly as helpless as they had assumed. The diner remained silent except for the sound of Jake's heavy breathing and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Everyone was frozen, watching a scene that none of them had expected to witness when they came out for dinner that night. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief as he realized he couldn't break free from Sarah's grip. The pain in his wrist was increasing and he could feel his fingers starting to go numb. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He was Jake Morrison, the man who had never lost a fight in his life. He was the one people crossed the street to avoid. And yet here he was, being controlled by a girl who looked like she should be studying for finals instead of handling grown men. His 3 friends finally snapped out of their shock and began to move toward Sarah. The stocky one, whose name was Danny, reached out to grab her shoulder from behind. Without releasing Jake's wrist, Sarah shifted her weight and drove her elbow backward into Danny's solar plexus with surgical precision. The impact knocked the wind out of him and sent him stumbling backward into a table, gasping for air. The other 2 men, Mike and Tony, hesitated. They had expected this to be easy, 4 against 1, with the one being a small woman who worked at a diner. But nothing about this situation was going according to plan. Sarah moved like someone who had been in fights before, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "I'm going to give you all one chance," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "You can apologize to Bill, pay your check, and leave quietly. Or we can continue this conversation, and I promise you won't like how it ends." Jake's face was red with pain and humiliation. Being embarrassed in front of his friends was bad enough, but being embarrassed by a woman in front of a room full of witnesses was unbearable. His reputation was everything to him, and he could see it crumbling with every second that passed. "You have no idea what you just started," he hissed through gritted teeth. "When I get loose from you, I'm going to make you regret the day you were born." Sarah's grip tightened slightly, causing Jake to wince. "You know what your problem is?" she asked conversationally. "You think strength is about hurting people who can't fight back. You think being tough means picking on waitresses and old men. But real strength is about protecting people who need protection. Real toughness is about standing up to bullies like you." Mike, the tallest of Jake's friends, decided to try a different approach. Instead of rushing at Sarah directly, he picked up a chair and raised it over his head, clearly intending to bring it down on her. The other customers in the diner gasped and several people screamed warnings. But Sarah had been tracking all 4 men since the confrontation began. She released Jake's wrist and spun toward Mike in one fluid motion. As the chair came down, she stepped inside his reach and struck upward with the palm of her hand, hitting him in the chest with enough force to knock him backward. The chair flew from his hands and crashed into the wall behind him. Jake rubbed his wrist and tried to rush Sarah while her back was turned, but she seemed to have eyes in the back of her head. She sidestepped his charge and used his own momentum against him, sending him crashing into the booth where they had been sitting. The table collapsed under his weight, sending plates and glasses crashing to the floor. Danny had finally caught his breath and was getting back to his feet, murder in his eyes. Tony, the 4th member of their group, had been hanging back, trying to figure out the best angle of attack. Now they both moved toward Sarah at the same time, thinking they could overwhelm her with numbers. Sarah's father had taught her that in a multiple opponent situation, the key was to never let them surround you and to keep moving, so they couldn't coordinate their attacks. She backed toward the center of the diner, giving herself more room to maneuver, and waited for them to make their move. Danny came at her first, swinging a wild haymaker that would have knocked her unconscious if it had connected. but Sarah ducked under the punch and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the floor again. As Tony tried to grab her from the side, she pivoted and caught him with a knee to the midsection that doubled him over. The entire sequence had taken less than 20 seconds, but to the people watching it felt like an eternity. 4 grown men who had walked into the diner acting like they owned the place were now sprawled around the floor, groaning and trying to figure out what had just happened to them. Bill stood with his mouth hanging open, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. The other customers were equally stunned. Some were recording with their phones, knowing that no one would believe this story without proof. Others were still trying to process the fact that their quiet, polite waitress had just single-handedly taken down 4 men who were each twice her size. Sarah stood in the middle of the chaos, breathing slightly harder than normal, but otherwise looking completely composed. Her uniform was barely wrinkled and her ponytail was still in place. She looked around at the 4 men who were slowly picking themselves up off the floor and shook her head, with what almost looked like disappointment. "This really didn't have to happen," she said sadly. "All you had to do was treat people with respect. All you had to do was act like decent human beings, but you chose to be bullies instead." Jake struggled to his feet, his face bruised and his pride shattered. He looked around at his friends, who were in various states of pain and embarrassment, and then back at Sarah. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. Every instinct told him to keep fighting, to escalate the situation until he found a way to win. But another part of him, a part he had buried years ago, was telling him something different. The diner remained silent as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Would Jake and his friends finally leave, or would they try to continue a fight they were clearly losing? Would someone call the police? Would this small-town diner become the site of an even bigger confrontation? Sarah stood ready for whatever came next. But there was something in her eyes that suggested she hoped the violence was over. She had proven her point and defended her friends. Now she just wanted these men to make the right choice and walk away. Jake stood there swaying slightly, blood trickling from a cut on his lip where he had hit the table. His whole world had just been turned upside down. For years he had built his identity around being the toughest guy in town, the one everyone feared. His reputation was his currency, his power, his entire sense of self-worth. And in less than a minute, a waitress who barely came up to his shoulder had destroyed all of it. But something else was happening inside Jake, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. As he looked at Sarah standing there, ready to defend herself and her friends against whatever he might try next, he saw something that reminded him of someone he used to know. Someone he used to be before life had made him hard and angry. The other customers in the diner were starting to whisper among themselves. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations, words like incredible and amazing and did you see that? Several people were still recording with their phones, and she realized that this incident was probably going to be all over social media within hours. Danny was the first of Jake's friends to speak. He was sitting on the floor holding his ribs where Sarah's elbow had connected, and looking at her with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What the hell are you?" he wheezed. Sarah looked down at him with something that might have been pity. "I'm just a waitress who learned a long time ago that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when you're scared." Mike was pulling himself up using a nearby chair, his face pale and his breathing labored. Tony was still doubled over, trying to catch his breath. Both of them kept glancing toward the door, clearly thinking about making a run for it. But they couldn't leave without Jake, and Jake wasn't moving. Bill finally found his voice. "Sarah, honey, where on earth did you learn to do that?" Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked like the sweet, friendly waitress everyone knew her to be. "My dad taught me that every person has the right to feel safe. He taught me that sometimes good people have to be willing to fight so that others don't have to." An elderly customer named Mrs. Peterson, who had been coming to Murphy's Diner for 15 years, stood up from her booth and began to clap. Slowly, other customers joined her until the entire diner was filled with applause. Sarah blushed and looked embarrassed by the attention, but she also looked proud. Jake watched this scene unfold with growing amazement. These people weren't just clapping because Sarah had won a fight. They were clapping because she had stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself. They were celebrating courage and kindness, qualities that Jake had forgotten even existed. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you just call the cops? Why did you risk getting hurt?" Sarah turned to look at him, And for the first time since the confrontation began, her expression softened slightly. Because someone needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Because standing by and watching someone get hurt when you have the power to stop it makes you part of the problem. Jake felt something break inside his chest, something that had been locked away for years. Suddenly he was 12 years old again, watching his father beat up a smaller man in a parking lot while a crowd of people stood by and did nothing. He remembered how desperately he had wanted someone, anyone, to step in and make it stop. He remembered how alone and helpless he had felt when no one came. I used to be different, he said almost to himself. I used to want to help people. Sarah studied his face carefully. She could see something there that his friends and probably most people missed. A pain that went deeper than any physical injury she could inflict. What happened? She asked gently. Jake looked around at his friends who were watching this conversation with growing unease. They didn't like this new direction things were taking. They preferred the old Jake, the one who solved problems with his fists and didn't worry about feelings or consequences. Life happened, Jake said bitterly. I learned that the world is divided between people who take and people who get taken from. I decided I wasn't going to be one of the ones who gets taken from anymore. Sarah nodded as if she understood. My dad used to say that the world is divided between people who make things better and people who make things worse. He said that every day in every situation we get to choose which kind of person we want to be. The diner had grown quiet again as people strained to hear this unexpected conversation between the young woman who had just demonstrated incredible fighting skills and the man who had come in planning to intimidate. Danny struggled to his feet, clearly angry about the direction this was heading. Jake, man, what are you doing? She just humiliated us in front of all these people. We can't just let this slide. But Jake wasn't listening to Danny anymore. He was thinking about choices and consequences, about the person he used to be and the person he had become. He was thinking about all the times over the years when he had used his size and reputation to get what he wanted, and how empty those victories had felt afterward. She didn't humiliate us, he said quietly. We humiliated ourselves the moment we walked in here acting like we owned the place. Mike and Tony exchanged worried looks. This wasn't the Jake they knew. The Jake they knew didn't apologize or show weakness or admit when he was wrong. The Jake they knew would be planning revenge right now, not having philosophical discussions with the person who had just beaten them up. Sarah watched Jake's face carefully, trying to decide if this change was real or just another manipulation. She had learned from her father that people in desperate situations would say anything to avoid consequences. But there was something in Jake's eyes that suggested his words might be genuine. You can still choose, she said softly. Right now, tonight, you can choose to be the person you used to be instead of the person you became. Jake looked around the diner at all the faces watching him. Some showed fear, some showed disgust, but a few showed something else. Hope. Hope that maybe this situation could end without more violence. Hope that maybe people really could change. The next few minutes would determine not just what happened in Murphy's diner that night, but what kind of man Jake Morrison would be for the rest of his life. Jake stood in the middle of the diner, surrounded by overturned chairs and broken dishes, feeling more lost than he had since he was a child. The weight of every bad decision he had made over the past 10 years seemed to press down on his shoulders. He looked at his three friends who were watching him with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust, and realized that they weren't really his friends at all. They were just people who enjoyed the power that came from being associated with his reputation. Danny wiped blood from his nose and glared at Jake with pure hatred. I can't believe you're just going to stand there and let her talk to you like that. After what she did to us, after she made us look like fools. She didn't make us look like fools, Jake said, his voice growing stronger. We did that ourselves. We came in here thinking we could push people around because we're bigger and meaner. We came in here acting like bullies, and when someone finally stood up to us, we got what we deserved. Tony shook his head in disbelief. Man, she must have hit you harder than I thought. You're talking crazy. We don't apologize to people. We don't back down. That's not who we are. But Jake was beginning to realize that maybe who they were wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. He looked at Sarah, who was standing quietly nearby, giving him space to make his choice but ready to defend herself if he made the wrong one. There was something about her calm strength that reminded him of his mother, who had died when he was 14. His mother had always believed that people could change, that it was never too late to choose a better path. You're right, Jake said to Tony. That's not who we are, but maybe it's time to figure out who we should be. Mike laughed harshly. Listen to yourself, man. You sound like some kind of greeting card. This chick beats us up and suddenly you want to join a church or something. Sarah stepped forward slightly. I didn't beat you up, she said calmly. I defended myself and my friends. There's a difference, and I'm not asking anyone to join anything. I'm just suggesting that maybe there's a better way to live than going around trying to intimidate people who haven't done anything to you. Bill, who had been watching this entire exchange with amazement, finally found the courage to speak. Jake, I've known you since you were a little kid. I remember when you used to come in here with your mom on Sunday mornings after church. You were a good kid then. Polite, respectful. What happened to that boy? Jake's eyes filled with tears that he quickly tried to blink away. He hadn't thought about those Sunday mornings in years. His mother had always ordered pancakes and orange juice, and she would tell him stories about his grandfather, who had been a decorated war hero. His grandfather had taught him that real men protected people who couldn't protect themselves, that strength was meant to be used in service of others. He got buried, Jake said quietly, under a lot of anger and pain and bad choices. But maybe he's still in there somewhere. The diner had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing to watch this extraordinary scene unfold. Mrs. Peterson wiped tears from her eyes, remembering the polite little boy who used to hold the door open for her when she came to the diner with her late husband. Danny stood up shakily, his face twisted with rage. I've heard enough of this garbage. Jake, you can stand here and have your little breakdown if you want, but I'm not sticking around to watch. And when word gets out about what happened here tonight, your reputation is going to be finished anyway. Nobody's going to respect someone who got taken down by a waitress. Good, Jake said, surprising everyone, including himself. Maybe it's time for a new reputation. Maybe it's time people knew me for something other than being someone they're afraid of. Danny stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head in disgust. You're pathetic. Come on, guys, let's get out of here. But Mike and Tony hesitated. They had been friends with Jake for years, and despite everything that had happened, they weren't ready to abandon him completely. Mike took a step forward. Jake, man, you don't have to do this. So what if we got caught off guard tonight? It happens. We learn from it and move on. But throwing away everything we've built together, that's not the answer. Jake looked at Mike, and for a moment he was tempted to take the easy path. It would be simple to blame what happened on bad luck or Sarah's unexpected skills. They could leave the diner, regroup, and go back to living the way they always had. No one outside this room had to know how badly things had gone for them tonight. But then he looked at Sarah again, and at Bill, and at all the other people in the diner who were watching him with hope in their eyes. He thought about his mother and his grandfather and the person he used to dream of becoming before life had beaten those dreams out of him. No, he said firmly, I'm done with that life. I'm done being someone that people have to be afraid of. I'm done taking what I want just because I'm big enough to take it. He reached into his wallet and pulled out $60, placing it on the nearest table. That should cover our meal and the damage we caused, he said to Bill, and I want to apologize. To you, to Sarah, and to everyone here. You all came out tonight to have a nice dinner and we ruined that. There's no excuse for how we acted. Bill stared at the money for a moment, then looked up at Jake with something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. Thank you, Jake, that means a lot. Sarah stepped forward and, to everyone's surprise, extended her hand to Jake. My name is Sarah Martinez. My father always taught me that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but whether they learn from them. Jake looked down at her small hand for a moment, then reached out and shook it gently. Jake Morrison, and your father sounds like a wise man. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but everyone in the diner understood that they were witnessing something significant. This wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a transformation. 3 months later, Sarah was working her usual Tuesday evening shift at Murphy's Diner when she saw a familiar figure walk through the front door. Jake Morrison looked completely different from the man who had tried to intimidate her that night. His hair was neatly trimmed, he was wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt, and there was something in his posture that spoke of genuine confidence rather than manufactured aggression. More importantly, he was alone. Danny, Mike, and Tony had made their choice that night, walking out of the diner and out of Jake's life. In the weeks that followed, Jake had learned that losing friends who only valued you for your worst qualities wasn't really losing anything at all. Sarah approached his table with a smile, notepad in hand. "Well, this is a surprise. What can I get you tonight?" Jake returned her smile, and she was struck by how different his face looked when it wasn't twisted with anger or false bravado. "Just coffee, if that's okay. Black, and maybe a few minutes of your time when you get a break." Sarah poured his coffee and told Bill she was taking her 15-minute break. She sat across from Jake in the same booth where this whole story had begun, curious about what he wanted to tell her. "I wanted to thank you," Jake said simply, "and I wanted to let you know how things have been going." Over the next few minutes, Jake told Sarah about the changes he had made in his life. He had gotten a job at a local construction company, where his size and strength were assets used for building rather than intimidating. He had started attending counseling sessions to deal with the anger and pain that had driven his behavior for so many years. Most importantly, he had begun volunteering at a youth center, working with kids who reminded him of himself at that age. "Last week," Jake said, his voice filled with pride, "I stopped a fight between two kids who were about to really hurt each other. But instead of using my fists, I used my words. I talked to them about choices and consequences, about the kind of men they wanted to become. And you know what? They listened." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "That's incredible, Jake. I'm so proud of you." "I never would have gotten here without that night," he continued. "When you stood up to me, when you showed me that real strength isn't about hurting people but about protecting them, you gave me something I hadn't had in years." "What's that?" "Hope. Hope that I could be better than I was. Hope that it wasn't too late to change." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the front of the diner. A young woman had come in, clearly upset about something. She was crying and talking rapidly to Bill about someone following her from the parking lot. Through the window, Sarah could see two men standing by a pickup truck, watching the diner and clearly waiting for something. Sarah's protective instincts kicked in immediately. She stood up from the booth, but Jake was already moving. Without a word, he walked over to the frightened young woman and knelt down to her level, his voice gentle and reassuring. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. Can you tell me what happened?" The woman, who couldn't have been more than 19, explained through her tears that the two men outside had been following her for several blocks, making crude comments and refusing to leave her alone when she asked them to stop. She had ducked into the diner hoping they would give up and go away, but they were still out there waiting. Jake looked through the window at the two men, and Sarah could see his jaw tighten. For a moment, she worried that he might revert to his old ways, that the sight of predators targeting a vulnerable young woman might trigger the violence he had worked so hard to overcome. But instead, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed 911. While he waited for the dispatcher, he sat down next to the young woman and continued talking to her in a calm, protective voice. "My name is Jake, and this is Sarah. We're not going to let anything happen to you. The police are on their way, and those guys out there are going to have to answer some questions about why they think it's okay to follow women around." Sarah watched this scene unfold with amazement. 3 months ago, Jake Morrison had been the kind of man that young women crossed the street to avoid. Now he was the kind of man they could turn to for protection. The transformation was so complete that if she hadn't witnessed it herself, she never would have believed it was possible. The police arrived within 5 minutes, and the two men outside were questioned and eventually arrested when it turned out they had outstanding warrants. The young woman, whose name was Jessica, thanked Jake and Sarah repeatedly before her boyfriend arrived to pick her up. After everyone had left and the diner had returned to normal, Jake and Sarah found themselves back in their booth, both slightly shaken by what had just happened. "That could have been really bad," Sarah said quietly. Jake nodded. 6 months ago, I probably would have just ignored it. Told myself it wasn't my problem. Or worse, I might have been one of those guys out there. But you weren't. Tonight, you were exactly the kind of person the world needs more of." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes again, but they were different from the tears he had shed that night 3 months ago. These were tears of gratitude and hope. "You know what the strangest part is?" he said. "I feel stronger now than I ever did when I was trying to intimidate people. When you're building something instead of tearing it down, when you're protecting people instead of hurting them, there's a power in that I never understood before." Sarah smiled. My father would say that's because you're finally using your strength for what it was meant for. As Jake prepared to leave that night, he paused at the door and turned back to Sarah. I have something I want to ask you. The youth center where I volunteer is having a self-defense workshop next month. We want to teach these kids how to protect themselves, but also how to know when to fight and when to walk away. Would you be willing to help? I think they could learn a lot from someone who knows how to be strong without being cruel. Sarah considered the offer for a moment, then nodded. I'd be honored to help. As Jake walked out into the night, Sarah watched him go with a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning a fight. 3 months ago, she had defended herself and her friends against 4 men who thought their size gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. But the real victory hadn't happened in those 40 seconds of conflict. The real victory was happening right now, in the form of a man who had chosen to become better than he was. It was happening in the youth center where Jake worked with kids who needed to see that change was possible. It was happening every time he chose to build instead of tear down, to protect instead of intimidate. Word of what had happened that night at Murphy's Diner had indeed spread throughout the small Colorado town, just as Jake had predicted. But the story that people told wasn't just about a waitress who could fight. It was about courage and redemption, about the power of standing up for what's right, and about the possibility that even the most hardened heart could learn to beat with compassion again. Sarah's father had been right about strength. Real strength wasn't about muscle or intimidation. It was about having the courage to do what was right even when you were afraid, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and about believing that people could change if they were given the chance. As Sarah finished cleaning up the diner that night, she thought about all the small moments that had led to this larger transformation, her father's lessons about courage and character, Jake's choice to listen instead of lash out, the community's decision to celebrate kindness over cruelty, Jessica's safety tonight because someone was willing to step up and help. These were the moments that really mattered, Sarah realized. Not the dramatic confrontations that made for good stories, but the quiet daily choices to be better, to do better, to build a world where people felt safe and valued and protected. The mess hall that had fallen silent that night 3 months ago now echoed with the sound of something much more powerful than violence. It echoed with the sound of hope, of second chances, and of the unshakable belief that no matter how dark things might seem, there was always a choice to walk toward the light. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you might even find someone willing to walk that path with you.